The stagecoach rattled to a halt, sending a plume of dust skyward that shimmered gold in the late afternoon sun. Ruby Ellison clutched her valise tightly as the small frontier town of Timber Creek came into view. It wasn't much a single dirt street lined with wooden buildings, their facades weathered by the harsh Wyoming Territory sun, but after 3 weeks of grueling travel, it represented something she'd never had before: freedom. "Last stop, miss," the driver called down. "Timber Creek." Ruby straightened her spine and adjusted her bonnet. The year was 1875, and proper young ladies didn't travel unaccompanied to remote mining towns. But Ruby Ellison had buried her parents 6 months ago, sold their failing millinery shop in Philadelphia, and decided that conformity to society's expectations had brought her nothing but grief. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the driver's calloused hand as she stepped down from the coach. The sound of her boot hitting the dirt seemed to echo across the town. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Heads turned. A woman alone had arrived in Timber Creek. Ruby kept her chin up as she moved toward what appeared to be the town's only hotel. She could hear the whispers already starting, see the raised eyebrows and judgmental stares. The women pulled their children closer, and the men assessed her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. "Well, look what just rolled into town," a voice called out, loud enough for all to hear. A heavy-set man with a handlebar mustache and an elaborate vest leaned against the post outside the saloon. "You lost, sweetheart, or just desperate?" Laughter rippled through the gathered onlookers. Ruby's cheeks burned, but she continued walking, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Probably one of them mail-order brides who got stood up," another voice added, triggering more laughter. Ruby clutched her valise tighter, knuckles whitening. She had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility, but the public mockery cut deeper than she'd anticipated. "That's enough." The voice was deep, commanding, and carried across the street with such authority that the laughter died instantly. Ruby turned to see a tall figure emerging from the livery stable across the way. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his worn leather vest, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Ruby's attention, piercing blue and utterly uncompromising as they swept across the crowd before settling on her. "Mason Zachary," a woman whispered nearby. "The ranch owner." The man called Mason crossed the street in long strides, stopping a respectful distance from Ruby. He touched the brim of his hat. "Madam, don't mind them. Timber Creek doesn't see many new faces, especially ones traveling alone." The heavy-set man from the saloon stepped forward. "Come now, Mason, even you gotta admit it's mighty peculiar. A woman traveling alone to Timber Creek, what's she running from, or who?" Mason turned to face the man, his stance relaxed but somehow threatening all the same. "The only peculiar thing I see is grown men with nothing better to do than harass a traveler." He glanced back at Ruby. "May I help you find your way, miss?" "Ellison," she supplied. "Ruby Ellison, and I'm perfectly capable of finding my own way, thank you." A hint of a smile touched Mason's lips. "I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Ellison," the heavy-set man snorted. "She won't last a week." "Let them laugh," Mason said quietly for Ruby's ears alone. "This town feeds on gossip like cattle on grass, but don't you worry about a thing." His gaze held hers, something fierce and protective flashing in those blue depths. "You're mine now," Ruby blinked, uncertain if she'd heard him correctly. "I beg your pardon, what I mean is," he clarified, his voice still low, "you're under my protection now. Nobody in Timber Creek will trouble you further, not if they value their business with the Double Z Ranch." Before Ruby could respond, Mason turned to address the onlookers who remained. "Miss Ellison is here on legitimate business. Anyone who suggests otherwise answers to me. Is that clear?" The crowd dispersed quickly, murmuring apologies or making excuses. Mason touched his hat again. "Hotel's right there, madam. Mrs. Halloway runs a clean establishment. Tell her I sent you." "Why are you helping me?" Ruby asked, studying his face for some clue to his motivation. "Because it's the right thing to do." He paused, then added, "And because I know what it's like to arrive somewhere new and be judged before you've said a single word." With that, he nodded once more and turned to leave. "Mr. Zachary," Ruby called after him. "Thank you." He glanced back over his shoulder. "Welcome to Timber Creek, Miss Ellison. It gets better than this, I promise." As she watched him walk away, Ruby couldn't help but wonder if she'd just found an ally or complicated her situation further. Either way, her arrival in Timber Creek had certainly not gone unnoticed or as planned. The hotel was modest but clean, just as Mason had indicated. Mrs. Halloway, a stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, eyed Ruby suspiciously until she mentioned Mason Zachary's name. The transformation was immediate. "Well, why didn't you say so right away?" Mrs. Halloway bustled around the counter, suddenly solicitous. "Any friend of Mr. Zachary's is welcome here. Best rooms on the corner, catches the morning light and the evening breeze." Ruby paid for a week in advance from her carefully counted savings. "I'm not actually a friend of Mr. Zachary's. We only just met." Mrs. Halloway paused in the act of recording Ruby's name in the ledger. "Is that so? Well, he's not a man who extends his protection lightly. Must have seen something in you worth safeguarding. Or perhaps he simply doesn't approve of bullying," Ruby suggested. The older woman gave a noncommittal hum. "Mr. Zachary doesn't involve himself in town business unless it matters to him personally. That's all I'm saying." She handed Ruby a key. "Room 3, top of the stairs, right-hand side. Breakfast is served from 6 to 8. Supper's extra, served at 6 sharp. Baths 50 cents extra, hot water Tuesdays and Fridays." "Thank you. I wonder if you might tell me where I could find the land office." "I have some business to attend to tomorrow." Mrs. Halloway's eyebrows rose. "Land office, now that's peculiar. It's 2 doors down from the general store, but Mr. Peterson only opens it on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "Perfect. Tomorrow is Thursday." The room was sparsely furnished, but spotless: a narrow iron bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that creaked when Ruby opened it to hang her few dresses. She unpacked methodically, arranging her mother's silver-backed hairbrush and hand mirror on the washstand, placing her father's pocket watch on the bedside table. These treasured keepsakes were all she had left of her family. Everything else had been sold to fund this journey and her new beginning. From the window, Ruby could see most of the main street. Timber Creek was smaller than she'd imagined from the advertisements, but it would serve her purpose. Land was affordable here, unclaimed by the railroad barons and cattle companies that were sweeping across the west. Her gaze drifted to the livery stable where she'd first seen Mason Zachary emerge. There was no sign of him now, but his words echoed in her mind. "You're mine now." It had been a declaration of protection, not possession, she was certain. Still, something in the way he'd said it had sent an unexpected thrill through her. Ruby shook her head, dismissing the thought. She hadn't come to Wyoming for romance or protection. She'd come for independence, to build something that belonged wholly to herself. She couldn't afford distractions, especially not in the form of a handsome rancher with piercing blue eyes. As evening fell, the sounds of the saloon grew louder: piano music, bursts of laughter, occasional shouts. Ruby sat at the small desk and opened her journal, recording the day's events and her initial impressions of Timber Creek. It wasn't the warm welcome she'd hoped for, but neither had it been the disaster she'd feared. Thanks to Mason Zachary. The next morning, Ruby dressed with particular care in her best walking suit, a deep blue wool that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair was twisted into a neat chignon at the nape of her neck, and she wore her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. First impressions mattered, especially at the land office. The dining room downstairs was empty except for a young couple who glanced up curiously when Ruby entered. Mrs. Halloway served a simple but hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with honey. "Land office opens at 9, the older woman informed her. "Mr. Peterson's particular about his time, not a minute earlier, not a minute later." At precisely 9 o'clock, Ruby pushed open the door to the land office. A small bell tinkled overhead, announcing her arrival. Inside, the office was cluttered with maps and ledgers, the air heavy with the smell of pipe tobacco and dust. "Be right with you," called a voice from the back room. Ruby examined a large map of the Wyoming Territory tacked to the wall, focusing on the area surrounding Timber Creek. Most of the prime land along the river was already claimed, she noted with disappointment. "Now then, how can I?" Mr. Peterson emerged from the back room and stopped short when he saw Ruby. He was a thin man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to owlish proportions. "Oh, a lady. I wasn't expecting. That is to say, how may I help you, miss?" "Ellison, Ruby Ellison. I'm interested in purchasing land near Timber Creek." "Land." Peterson blinked rapidly. "For your husband, I presume?" "For myself, Mr. Peterson. I'm unmarried." The land agent's confusion deepened. "I see. Well, Miss Ellison, land ownership is a serious responsibility. There are property taxes, development requirements. I'm well aware of the legal requirements, sir. I've studied the Homestead Act thoroughly." Ruby extracted a folded document from her handbag. "I have here a letter from my bank in Philadelphia confirming my financial standing. I'm prepared to pay cash for the right parcel." Peterson took the letter, examining it with poorly concealed surprise. "Well, this appears to be in order, but I must advise you that life out here is very different from Philadelphia. The land is unforgiving, Miss Ellison. Men twice your size have failed to tame it." "I'm not looking to tame it, Mr. Peterson. I simply want to work it and live from it." "Now, can you show me what's available within 5 miles of town?" Reluctantly, Peterson unrolled a detailed map of the immediate area. "The parcels in green are already claimed. The yellow are under dispute or pending final payment. The white areas are available." Ruby studied the map carefully. Most of the white areas were far from water or on steep terrain land nobody else wanted. One parcel caught her eye, however. It was modest in size, about 100 acres, with a small stream running through one corner. It backed up to the foothills, providing natural shelter from the wind. "What about this one?" She pointed to the spot. Peterson frowned. "That's technically available, but I wouldn't recommend it. It borders the Double Z Ranch to the north. Mason Zachary's been trying to buy it for years to expand his grazing land. If it's available, I'd like to make an offer." "Miss Ellison, I don't think you understand. Mason Zachary is the most powerful man in this county. He won't take kindly to someone snatching land he's had his eye on." Ruby straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Peterson, is there any legal reason I cannot purchase this land?" "Well, no, but then I would like to proceed. How much?" Peterson named a figure that was slightly higher than Ruby had expected, but still within her means. She counted out the bills from her handbag, aware of Peterson's growing discomfort. "I'll need to draw up the deed," he said finally. "It will take a day or two." "That's fine. I'll return on Saturday to collect it." As Ruby turned to leave, Peterson called after her. "Miss Ellison, a word of advice. Speak to Mason Zachary before you get too settled on that land. It would be prudent." Ruby nodded, though she had no intention of seeking Mason's approval. She'd come to the Wyoming Territory to escape men making decisions for her. She wouldn't start her new life by asking permission. Outside the land office, Ruby paused to take in the morning activity along the main street. The general store was doing a brisk business, and several wagons had pulled up in front of the livery stable. She decided to visit the general store to inquire about supplies she'd need for her new property. She was examining bolts of fabric when the store bell jingled. The shopkeeper, who had been coolly polite until then, suddenly became animated. "Mr. Zachary, good to see you, sir. What can I help you with today?" Ruby turned to see Mason Zachary standing just inside the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He was dressed much as he had been the day before, though his face was freshly shaved. His gaze swept the store before landing on her, and a flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Miss Ellison, good morning. Mr. Zachary." She nodded, trying to ignore the quickening of her pulse. "I need supplies for the ranch," he told the shopkeeper, but his eyes remained on Ruby. "Flour, coffee, sugar, the usual, and nails. 4 pounds of the 3-inch. Right away, Mr. Zachary." As the shopkeeper bustled about filling the order, Mason moved closer to Ruby. "I trust you found suitable accommodations at Mrs. Halloway's." I did, thank you. She was quite accommodating once I mentioned your name. A faint smile touched his lips. Mrs. Halloway's bark is worse than her bite. Have you had any more trouble in town? None at all. Your intervention seems to have worked wonders. Good. He paused, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. May I ask what brings you to our little corner of Wyoming? It's not often we get visitors from the east who aren't just passing through. Ruby hesitated, reluctant to mention her land purchase, knowing it might create conflict. I'm seeking a fresh start, Mr. Zachary. My parents died last year and there was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia. I'm sorry for your loss. The sympathy in his voice sounded genuine. Still, Wyoming territory is an unusual choice for a woman alone. It's not an easy place. So I've been told. Repeatedly. Ruby couldn't keep a hint of irritation from her voice. And yet men come here alone all the time and no one questions their judgment. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. Fair point, Miss Ellison, though I'd argue that life here is hard on anyone, regardless of gender. Then we're agreed that I deserve the same opportunity to succeed or fail as any man. A slow smile spread across his face, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, softening the hard lines and bringing warmth to those blue eyes. We are indeed agreed on that point, though I hope you'll succeed rather than fail. The shopkeeper returned with Mason's supplies packed in crates. Will there be anything else, Mr. Zachary? That's all for today, thanks. He turned back to Ruby. Miss Ellison, would you allow me to buy you lunch at the hotel? I'd be interested to hear more about your plans. Ruby considered declining. The prudent thing would be to keep her distance, especially given what she now knew about his interest in the land she'd just purchased. But curiosity won out curiosity about this man who had defended her, about why he wanted the land, and about what life was truly like in Timber Creek. That would be lovely, Mr. Zachary. Thank you. Mason, please. Mr. Zachary was my father. Then you must call me Ruby. They walked side by side to the hotel, drawing curious glances from townspeople. Ruby was acutely aware of how it must look, the mysterious Eastern woman dining with Mason Zachary less than 24 hours after arriving in town. Gossip would spread like wildfire. Mrs. Halloway showed them to a corner table in the hotel's small dining room, her expression betraying nothing but professional courtesy. The special today is beef stew with dumplings. That sounds perfect, Mason said. When they were alone, Mason leaned back in his chair, regarding Ruby with undisguised interest. So, Philadelphia to Timber Creek, that's quite a journey. It was. 3 weeks of dust, uncomfortable seats, and questionable traveling companions. What made you choose Timber Creek specifically? There are more established towns with more amenities for someone used to city life. Here was the question she'd been dreading. Ruby took a sip of water, considering her response. Honesty, she decided, was the best approach. I saw an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. Land for sale in the Wyoming territory, affordable and plentiful. I wanted somewhere I could build something of my own, away from the constraints of Eastern society. And what is it you plan to build, Ruby? A home, a business, a life that belongs to me alone. She met his gaze directly. I purchased land this morning, Mason, 100 acres with a stream running through it. Mr. Peterson informs me it borders your ranch. Mason's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or respect. The Miller parcel. You know it. I know every inch of land within 20 miles of Timber Creek. He paused as Mrs. Halloway brought their stew and fresh bread. When she'd gone, he continued, That's challenging land, Ruby. The stream dries up in late summer most years. The soil's rocky on the western side. Are you trying to discourage me? I'm giving you facts. What you do with them is your business. He tore a piece of bread, his movements deliberate. May I ask what you plan to do with the land? Ruby had considered several options during her journey west. I thought perhaps a small farm. Vegetables, chickens, maybe a dairy cow or two, nothing ambitious to start. Farming is ambitious enough in this country. He took a bite of stew, watching her. The growing season's short, winters are harsh, you'd need help. I can hire help when I need it. With what money? Forgive me for being blunt, but establishing a farm requires capital for seed, livestock, equipment, a house. Did your purchase leave you with sufficient funds? Ruby bristled at the personal question but answered honestly. I have enough to get established if I'm careful. And I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Zachary. Mason, he corrected gently. Mason. She softened her tone. I understand your concern, but I've thought this through. I didn't come west on a whim. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, and I admire your determination. He set down his spoon. I'd like to make you an offer, Ruby. Let me buy the land from you at a profit to yourself, of course. I'll pay 20% above what you paid this morning. Ruby was taken aback. You want to buy my land? I've only just purchased it. The Miller parcel completes a section of my ranch. I've been trying to acquire it for years, but old Miller was stubborn, and after he died, his heirs were in no hurry to sell. He leaned forward. You'd make a tidy profit without having to risk everything on an uncertain venture. With that money, you could establish yourself in town, perhaps open a shop or a restaurant. Is that what you think I should do? Stay in town where it's safe and proper? Mason shook his head. I think you should do whatever makes you happy. I'm merely offering an alternative that might be less physically demanding and financially risky. Ruby considered his words. The offer was generous, and the profit would indeed provide her with a cushion of safety. But it would mean surrendering the dream that had brought her across the country. I appreciate your offer, Mason, but I must decline. That land represents something important to me: independence, a fresh start, a chance to build something that's entirely my own. Instead of the disappointment or frustration she expected, Mason's expression held something that looked remarkably like respect. I thought you might say that. Your determination is admirable if somewhat inconvenient to my plans. His eyes crinkled at the corners. Very well, then. Since we're to be neighbors, perhaps we can help each other. Help each other? My ranch hands and I have the skills and equipment you'll need to establish your farm. We can help with building a cabin, digging a well, preparing the soil. In exchange, perhaps you could provide us with fresh vegetables once your garden is producing. The men get tired of a steady diet of beans and salt pork. Ruby was suspicious of this sudden generosity. Why would you help me when you clearly want the land for yourself? Because neighbors look out for each other in this country. It's how we all survive. He leaned back, his gaze steady. And because I admire your spirit, Ruby Ellison, not many would do what you're doing. And if I fail, will you be waiting to buy my land when I can't make it work? His expression grew serious. I won't deny I'd still be interested in the property, but I'd rather see you succeed. He held her gaze. What do you say, neighbors? Ruby considered his offer. Having Mason's help would significantly increase her chances of establishing a viable farm. Yet accepting might create a sense of obligation she couldn't afford. I'll accept your help with building the cabin and digging the well, she said finally. But I'll pay fair wages for the work. I don't want charity, Mason. A smile spread slowly across his face. You're a stubborn woman, Ruby Ellison. I prefer determined, as you wish. He extended his hand across the table. Determined it is. Ruby took his hand, struck by how completely it enveloped hers. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, but his grip was gentle. Something passed between them in that moment, a current of understanding, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to name. Over the next few days, Ruby settled into a routine at the hotel while making preparations for her move to the property. She collected her deed from a still disapproving Mr. Peterson on Saturday morning, visited the general store to order supplies, and arranged for a wagon to transport everything to her land the following week. Throughout town, she was met with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Few people were openly hostile, thanks to Mason's protection, but neither were they particularly welcoming. Only Mrs. Halloway seemed to be warming to her, offering advice about the harsh Wyoming winters and which vegetables grew best in the rocky soil. On Sunday morning, Ruby was surprised when Mason appeared at the hotel just after breakfast, dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his hat in his hands. Good morning, Ruby. I wondered if you might like to ride out to see your property today. The weather's fine, and it would give you a chance to start planning where to place your cabin and garden. Ruby had been eager to see her land again. "I'd like that very much, but I don't have a horse." "I've brought a mount for you. Daisy's the gentlest mare at the Double Z." Even a city girl could handle her. Ruby smiled at the gentle teasing. "I'll have you know I took riding lessons as a girl, Mr. Zachary. I'm not entirely helpless." "I never thought you were." His eyes held a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Shall we go, then?" Ruby changed quickly into her plainest skirt and blouse, suitable for riding. When she returned downstairs, she found Mason waiting patiently in the hotel lobby, conversing with Mrs. Halloway. Outside, 2 horses were tied to the hitching post, a powerful chestnut stallion that must be Mason's mount, and a dappled gray mare who regarded Ruby with gentle brown eyes. "This is Daisy," Mason said, helping Ruby mount. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, lifting her effortlessly into the saddle. "She prefers a light touch on the reins." Ruby settled herself, grateful that her riding lessons hadn't been completely forgotten. The side saddle was awkward compared to the modern riding habits she'd worn in Philadelphia, but she adjusted quickly. Mason swung up onto his stallion with practiced ease. Ready, they rode out of town at a leisurely pace, Mason pointing out landmarks and explaining the lay of the land. Timber Creek had been named for the small stream that ran through the valley. He told her, though the timber was mostly gone now, harvested for building the town and mining operations further north. "The town's changed a lot since I first came here 12 years ago," he said as they followed a well-worn trail heading east. "It was little more than a trading post then, just a handful of buildings. Now we've got almost 300 people, more during cattle season." "How did you come to settle here?" Ruby asked, genuinely curious about this man who had become her unlikely ally. Mason was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I was 19, looking for work and a fresh start. My father had been a rancher in Colorado, but we lost everything in '63, the drought, then rustlers, then the bank came calling. After he died, there was nothing keeping me there." "I'm sorry about your father," he nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "I drifted for a while, worked as a ranch hand, saved every penny. When I heard about land opening up in the Wyoming territory, I took a chance. Bought 50 acres to start with, just a shack and some scrubby pasture, worked other ranches while building my own herd." "And now you own the largest ranch in the area," Ruby observed. "The Double Z is modest compared to some operations, but it's mine. Every acre, every head of cattle I earned through hard work and some lucky breaks." He glanced at her. "That's something we have in common, I think. The desire to build something that belongs entirely to ourselves." Ruby nodded, struck by how accurately he'd understood her motivation. "Yes, exactly that." They crested a small rise and Mason reined in his horse. "There it is, your land." Ruby drew in a breath as she looked down at the valley spread before them. It was more beautiful than she'd imagined from the map, a gentle slope leading down to a narrow stream, meadow grasses waving in the breeze, the foothills rising beyond. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in patches of purple, yellow, and white. "It's lovely," she whispered. "It is," Mason agreed. "Especially this time of year. Come winter, those hills will be buried in snow, and the wind comes down off the mountains like it's trying to scour the land clean." "You're trying to frighten me again," Ruby said, but without heat. Mason smiled. "Just preparing you, the West has no patience for dreamers who don't respect its power." He pointed to a cluster of cottonwood trees near the stream. "That would be a good spot for your cabin. Natural shelter from the wind, close to water and the ground's level." They rode down into the valley, dismounting near the cottonwoods. The stream gurgled merrily over rocks, the water clear and cold. Ruby knelt and dipped her fingers into it, feeling a sense of ownership and responsibility that was entirely new. "This is mine," she said softly, almost to herself. Mason stood a few paces away, giving her this moment. "Yes, it is." Ruby rose and looked around, trying to envision her farm taking shape. The cabin there, as you suggested, a vegetable garden to the south for maximum sun, perhaps a chicken coop nearby. The dairy cow would need a small barn eventually. "You've thought this through," Mason observed. I had 3 weeks on the stagecoach with nothing to do but plan. Ruby walked a few steps, mentally marking boundaries. How soon could we start on the cabin? I don't want to impose on Mrs. Halloway's hospitality any longer than necessary. My men can begin clearing the site tomorrow. We've got enough timber at the ranch for a simple cabin, nothing fancy but solid. It would take about 2 weeks to get something habitable built. 2 weeks? Ruby turned to him, surprised. I expected it would take much longer. It would if you were doing it alone. But I've got 5 hands who can help when they're not needed at the ranch. And barn raising is something of a tradition out here, neighbors helping neighbors. He paused. Though I should warn you, it will be very basic. 1 room probably with a stone fireplace for cooking and heat. That's all I need to start, Ruby assured him. I can add on later as I can afford it. They spent the next hour walking the property, Mason pointing out its strengths and weaknesses with candid honesty. The soil was decent in the lower areas, he explained, but rocky near the hills. The stream usually ran year-round, though it dwindled to a trickle in late summer. Game was plentiful. Deer came down from the hills regularly, and there were rabbits, grouse, and wild turkeys to supplement her diet. You'll need to learn to shoot, he said matter-of-factly. Not just for hunting, but for protection. There are wolves in the hills, and occasionally a mountain lion comes down looking for easy prey. I've never fired a gun, Ruby admitted. I'll teach you. Every ranch woman knows how to handle a rifle out here, ranch woman. The words gave Ruby pause. It wasn't how she thought of herself, yet here she was, planning a life that would indeed make her a ranch woman of sorts. As they prepared to leave, Mason helped her back onto Daisy, his hands lingering slightly longer at her waist than strictly necessary. Ruby felt the warmth of his touch even after he'd released her and mounted his own horse. Thank you for showing me the land, she said as they rode back toward town, and for offering your help with the cabin. It's the neighborly thing to do. His expression was unreadable. Besides, I have selfish motives. Oh, Ruby raised an eyebrow. Fresh vegetables, remember? My cook, Hank, tries his best, but there's only so much a man can do with dried beans and salt pork. Mason's eyes crinkled with humor. My men will work twice as hard if they think there are fresh tomatoes and corn in their future. Ruby laughed, a light, genuine sound that surprised even herself. It had been a long time since she'd laughed like that. Then I shall have to make sure my garden produces abundantly. They rode back to town in comfortable conversation, Mason telling stories about the characters of Timber Creek and the surrounding area. By the time they reached the hotel, Ruby realized she'd enjoyed herself more than she had in months. Mason dismounted and helped her down from Daisy. I'll send my foreman, Charlie, and a couple of men over to start clearing the site tomorrow. I'll join them when I can. I'd like to be there, Ruby said. To help or at least to observe, of course. Charlie can collect you in the wagon around 7 if that's not too early, not at all. I'm an early riser. Mason held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Until tomorrow, then. As she watched him ride away, leading Daisy behind his stallion, Ruby felt a confusing mixture of emotions. Gratitude for his help, certainly. Excitement about seeing her land transformed into a home. But there was something else, too, a warmth that spread through her chest whenever Mason looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. It was attraction, she admitted to herself. Pure and simple, and entirely impractical. She hadn't come to Wyoming to find a husband, she'd come to find independence. Getting involved with Mason Zachary, a man who clearly wanted her land, would be foolish at best, disastrous at worst. Still, as she prepared for bed that night, Ruby couldn't help remembering the strength of his hands at her waist, the respect in his eyes as he spoke of her plans, and the way he defended her that first day in town. Let them laugh. You're mine now. The words echoed in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. True to his word, Mason's foreman arrived promptly at 7 the next morning. Charlie Wilkins was a weathered man in his 50s with a bushy mustache and kind eyes. He greeted Ruby with cautious respect. Mason says you're to be included in all the decisions, madam, he said as they drove out of town in the wagon. It's your place, after all. 2 ranch hands rode alongside Tom, a gangly young man barely out of his teens, and Elijah, a quiet, steady worker with massive shoulders and gentle hands. They reached Ruby's property to find Mason already there with another wagon loaded with tools and supplies. The work began immediately. The men cleared the site where Ruby's cabin would stand, removing rocks and leveling the ground. Ruby insisted on helping, gathering smaller stones for what would become her fireplace and clearing brush. By midday, the site was ready. Mason and Charlie measured out the cabin's footprint 16 feet by 24 feet, larger than Ruby had expected. "It needs to be big enough to get you through the winter," Mason explained when she questioned it. "You'll be spending a lot of time indoors once the snow flies." The foundation was laid that first day, flat stones carefully placed to keep the cabin floor above the damp ground. Ruby worked alongside the men until her hands were blistered and her back ached, but she refused to stop until they did. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, Mason called a halt to the day's work. "That's enough for today. We've made good progress." Charlie and the others packed up the tools while Mason walked with Ruby to the stream to wash the dirt from their hands. "You worked hard today," he observed, watching as she winced at the sting of water on her blistered palms. So did everyone. "I won't ask others to do what I'm not willing to do myself." Mason took her hands in his, turning them palm up to examine the blisters. "Admirable, but foolish. These hands aren't used to this kind of work yet." His touch was gentle as he examined her injuries. Ruby was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the concern in his eyes, of the strength in his calloused fingers as they cradled hers. "I have some salve back at the ranch that will help," he said, releasing her hands reluctantly. "I'll bring it tomorrow, and gloves. You need work gloves." "Thank you." Ruby's voice was softer than she intended. "For everything." Mason's gaze held hers for a long moment. "You're welcome, Ruby." That night, despite her exhaustion, Ruby wrote in her journal by lamplight, recording the day's progress and her growing feelings of accomplishment. She was doing it, creating the life she dreamed of. And Mason Zachary, the man who by all rights should be her competitor for the land, had become her most steadfast ally. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. Each morning, Charlie would collect Ruby from the hotel and they would work on the cabin all day. Mason joined them when he could, though ranch business often called him away. The walls rose steadily, log by log, and the stone fireplace took shape at one end. Ruby learned quickly, her determination making up for her lack of experience. She helped notch logs, mixed mud for chinking, and gathered stones for the fireplace. Her hands toughened, her skin browned in the sun, and her city clothes became stained with dirt and pine sap. The townspeople's attitudes began to shift as they watched her work alongside the ranch hands day after day. Curiosity replaced skepticism, and some even offered help or advice. Mrs. Halloway packed lunches for her without being asked. Mr. Franklin at the general store extended her credit when she needed supplies, saying, "Any woman who works as hard as you do is good for her debts." As promised, Mason taught Ruby to shoot using a Winchester rifle that had belonged to his father. "It's lighter than most, good for a beginner," he explained as they set up targets behind her half-built cabin. Ruby was a quick study, her natural steadiness and sharp eye making up for her lack of experience. After an hour of practice, she could hit a can at 20 paces more often than not. "Not bad," Mason approved. "Keep practicing. Eventually, it'll become second nature." "Like building a cabin?" Ruby asked with a smile, flexing her sore but no longer blistered hands. "Exactly like that." Their relationship evolved during those weeks of shared labor. The initial wariness gave way to mutual respect, which in turn blossomed into genuine friendship. They learned each other's stories: Mason's years of struggle to build his ranch, Ruby's stifling life in Philadelphia after her parents fell ill. They discovered shared values: hard work, independence, resilience, and beneath it all, an attraction neither could deny grew stronger with each passing day. It was in the lingering glances, the unnecessary touches, the conversations that lasted long after the work was done. Ruby found herself looking forward to seeing Mason each day, disappointed when ranch business kept him away. As the cabin neared completion, Ruby realized she'd come to rely on Mason's presence in a way she'd never intended. It troubled her. Independence had been her goal, yet here she was, developing feelings for a man who had become integral to her new life. The cabin was finished on a clear Saturday in early June. The men had worked extra hours to complete it, adding a small porch at the front and shelves inside for Ruby's belongings. Simple curtains hung at the two windows, a gift from Mrs. Halloway, and the stone fireplace stood ready to provide warmth and cooking heat. "It's perfect," Ruby said, standing in the doorway of what was now her home. "I can't thank you all enough." Charlie tipped his hat. "Our pleasure, Miss Ellison, though I reckon the boss deserves most of the thanks. He's the one who pushed us to get it done right." The men loaded their tools into the wagon and headed back toward town, leaving Mason and Ruby alone at the cabin. They stood side by side on the small porch, looking out at the land that was now truly hers. "I'll move in tomorrow," Ruby said. "Mrs. Halloway is already lamenting the loss of her paying guest," Mason smiled. "She's grown fond of you. Most of the town has, I think. Thanks to you." Ruby turned to face him. "I know what you did, Mason, how you made it clear I was under your protection." "You've earned their respect on your own," he said, but there was pleasure in his eyes at her acknowledgement. "Working alongside my men, learning to shoot, refusing to give up when things got difficult. Still, I wouldn't have had the chance without your initial intervention." Ruby placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." His gaze dropped to her hand, then rose to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a decision made, perhaps, or a surrender to something inevitable. "Ruby," he began, his voice deeper than usual, "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. A rider was coming fast up the trail from town. Tom, the young ranch hand, his face grave. "Boss," he called as he reined in his horse. "You're needed at the ranch. There's trouble." Mason's expression hardened. "What kind of trouble?" "Cattle rustlers hit the north pasture, got away with about 40 head. Charlie's gathering the men, but he sent me to find you first." Mason swore under his breath. "I'll be right there." He turned to Ruby, conflict clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I have to go." "Of course." She stepped back, disappointment warring with understanding. "Go, your ranch needs you." He hesitated just a moment longer, then swung up onto his horse. "I'll come by tomorrow, check how you're settling in." "Be careful, Mason." The concern in her voice seemed to touch him. His expression softened briefly. "Always am." Then he was gone, galloping away with Tom, leaving Ruby alone at her new home. Whatever he had been about to say would have to wait. Ruby moved into her cabin the next day as planned, bringing her few possessions from the hotel. Mrs. Halloway insisted on accompanying her, bringing a basket of food and household necessities as a housewarming gift. "It's not much," the older woman said, setting the basket on Ruby's new table, a simple pine piece that Mason's men had built for her. "But every home needs the basics." Inside, Ruby found candles, matches, salt, sugar, coffee, a loaf of fresh bread, and even a small jar of strawberry preserves. Beneath these practical items was a patchwork quilt in shades of blue and green. "Mrs. Halloway," Ruby breathed, lifting the quilt. "This is too generous." "Nonsense. Every home needs a proper quilt." The older woman looked around the cabin with a critical eye. "It's a good, solid place. Mason's men did fine work, but it's going to need a woman's touch to make it a home." After Mrs. Halloway left, Ruby spent the day arranging her belongings and making the cabin her own. She placed her mother's silver hairbrush on a small shelf, her father's pocket watch on the mantel. The quilt brightened the narrow bed in the corner. By evening, the space felt like hers, simple but comfortable. As darkness fell, Ruby lit the lamps and built her first fire in the stone fireplace. The wood caught quickly, filling the cabin with warm light and the scent of pine. She made a simple supper of bread and cheese from Mrs. Halloway's basket, sitting at her table and looking around with a sense of satisfaction. This was what she had come for, a place of her own, built with her own hands, with help, she admitted, on land she owned outright. Independence. So why did the cabin feel emptier than she'd expected? Why did she find herself listening for hoofbeats, hoping Mason would fulfill his promise to check on her? Ruby slept fitfully that first night, the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming night keeping her alert. Wind in the cottonwoods, the occasional howl of a distant coyote, the constant gurgle of the stream, all sounds she would need to learn to sleep through. Morning brought renewed determination. After breakfast, Ruby set to work planning her garden. She marked out a plot near the cabin, then began the laborious process of turning the soil with a spade Mason had left for her. It was hard work, but satisfying to see the neat rows take shape. By midday, her back ached and her arms trembled with exhaustion, but a quarter of the garden plot was prepared. Ruby sat on her porch with a cup of water, allowing herself a moment of rest. The sound of approaching horses brought her to her feet. 3 riders were coming from the direction of town, and none of them was Mason or his men. As they drew closer, Ruby recognized the heavyset man who had mocked her arrival in Timber Creek, Frank Darnell, she'd learned, owner of the saloon. With him were 2 men she didn't know, rough-looking types with hard eyes. Ruby went inside and returned with the Winchester rifle Mason had given her. She didn't raise it, but held it ready as the men approached. "That's close enough," she called when they were about 50 feet from the cabin. Darnell reined in his horse, signaling his companions to do the same. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Miss Ellison," he called. "Fine day, isn't it? Settling into your new home. What do you want, Mr. Darnell?" "Just being neighborly. Thought I'd check on you, seeing as Zachary's occupied with his rustler problem." Darnell's gaze traveled over the cabin, the partially turned garden, and finally Ruby herself. "Quite a project you've taken on here. Might be too much for a woman alone. I'm managing just fine, thank you." Darnell dismounted, ignoring Ruby's warning, and took a few steps toward the cabin. "You know, I might be interested in buying this place from you, save you all this trouble." Ruby's grip tightened on the rifle. "This land isn't for sale." "Everything has a price, Miss Ellison." Darnell's smile disappeared. "Zachary's been wanting this parcel for years. Now you swoop in and grab it out from under him. Makes a man wonder what's so special about it." "Nothing's special about it except that it's mine." Ruby raised the rifle slightly. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd leave now." One of Darnell's companions laughed. "She's got spirit, Frank. Too much spirit," Darnell said, his expression darkening. "Listen, Miss Ellison, you're in over your head. This isn't Philadelphia. A woman alone can't survive out here, no matter how many guns Zachary gives her." "I'll take my chances." Darnell took another step forward. "I don't think you understand your position. Timber Creek isn't a place that welcomes troublemakers or people who don't know their place." Ruby raised the rifle to her shoulder, aiming directly at Darnell's chest. Her hands were steady, her voice firm. "I understand my position perfectly, Mr. Darnell. I'm standing on my land with a loaded rifle, asking you politely to leave. The next request won't be polite." For a tense moment, Darnell stared at her, weighing his options. Then a slow smile spread across his face. Well, the lady has teeth." He backed up slowly, returning to his horse. "We'll be going, Miss Ellison, but remember what I said. Everything has a price." The 3 men mounted and rode away, Darnell turning once to tip his hat mockingly. Ruby kept the rifle raised until they were out of sight, then lowered it with trembling hands. The confidence she'd projected was more bravado than reality. If Darnell had called her bluff, she wasn't certain she could have pulled the trigger. She spent the rest of the day glancing nervously toward the trail, the rifle never far from reach. By evening, she was exhausted from tension as much as from the physical labor of the garden. As she prepared a simple supper, the sound of another rider approaching set her heart racing. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, watching as a familiar figure on a chestnut stallion came into view. Mason. Relief flooded through her. Ruby set the rifle aside and went to meet him, suddenly conscious of her dirt-stained clothes and disheveled hair. Mason dismounted wearily, and Ruby could see the exhaustion etched on his face. "I'm sorry I couldn't come earlier," he said. "We've been tracking the rustlers since yesterday. Did you find them?" "No, they headed into the mountains and the trail went cold." He ran a hand through his hair, which was dusty from the ride. "We lost a good number of cattle." "I'm sorry, Mason." Ruby hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to come in? I was just making supper, nothing fancy, but there's plenty. Gratitude flickered in his tired eyes. That would be welcome. Thank you. Inside the cabin, Mason looked around with approval. You've made it yours already. It's coming along. Ruby busied herself at the small stove, adding another portion to the pot of beans and bacon. Mrs. Halloway brought me some essentials yesterday. Including that quilt, I'd wager. Mason smiled. She made one for me when I first built my ranch house, said no home was complete without a proper quilt. Ruby ladled the simple meal into bowls and placed them on the table. Sit, please, you look exhausted. I am, he admitted, sinking into one of the chairs. We've been in the saddle since dawn yesterday. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Ruby debated whether to mention Darnell's visit, reluctant to add to Mason's worries, but knowing he should be informed. Frank Darnell paid me a visit today, she said finally. With two men I didn't recognize. Mason's head snapped up, weariness forgotten. What did he want? To buy my land, apparently. He seemed to think I'd be eager to sell, given the challenges of managing alone. Did he threaten you? Mason's voice was dangerously quiet, not directly, but the implication was clear enough. Mason's jaw tightened. Darnell's been trying to expand his holdings for years. He owns the saloon, the livery stable, and several buildings in town. He's not used to being refused. Well, he's going to have to get used to it, Ruby said firmly. I'm not selling to him or anyone else. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips despite his obvious anger. I believe you. He studied her face. Were you afraid? Yes, Ruby admitted, but I didn't let him see it. Your shooting lessons came in handy. I don't think he expected me to know how to handle a rifle. Good. Mason's expression was grim, but Darnell doesn't give up easily. He might come back or send others. I can handle myself. I don't doubt that, but you shouldn't have to. Mason pushed his empty bowl aside. Ruby, there's something I need to tell you, something I was going to say yesterday before Tom interrupted us. Ruby's heart quickened. Yes. I want you to know that my offer to help you wasn't just about being neighborly or even about hoping to buy your land someday. He met her gaze directly. I helped because I admire you. Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and faced down this town with your chin up, I couldn't look away. Ruby's breath caught. Mason, let me finish, please. His voice was gentle but determined. I know you came here for independence. I respect that it's what I wanted too when I first came to Wyoming, but I've learned that independence doesn't have to mean being alone. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I care for you, Ruby, more than I expected to, more than is probably wise. And if Darnell or anyone else threatens you again, I want them to know exactly what they're risking. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it. His thumb traced circles on her palm. I'm saying I want everyone in Timber Creek to know that you're important to me, not just as a neighbor, not just as a friend. Ruby stared at their joined hands, emotions warring within her. She'd come to Wyoming to escape the expectations of others, to build a life on her own terms. Yet here was Mason Zachary, offering something she hadn't expected to find: companionship, protection, and something that felt remarkably like love. I didn't come here looking for this, she said softly. Neither did I. Mason's gaze was steady. But here we are. Ruby took a deep breath. I care for you too, Mason, but I need you to understand something. This land, this cabin, they're mine. I won't give them up, not even for you. I wouldn't ask you to. He squeezed her hand. Your independence is part of what I admire about you, Ruby. I don't want to take that away. I just want to be part of your life if you'll have me. The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't a ploy to get her land or to control her. This was a man who respected her choices, who saw her strength and valued it. Yes, Ruby said, her voice stronger now. I'll allow it. I'd like that very much. The weariness seemed to lift from Mason's shoulders. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Thank you. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Mason released her hand reluctantly and stood. I should go. It's getting late and you need your rest. You'll come back tomorrow. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. He moved to the door, then turned back. Keep that rifle handy, Ruby, just in case, and if Darnell comes back, fire a shot in the air. I'll hear it at the ranch. After Mason left, Ruby stood on her porch watching his silhouette disappear into the darkness. The night no longer seemed so lonely, the sounds of the wilderness no longer so alien. She belonged here now to this land, to this life she was building, and perhaps, in some new and unexpected way, to Mason Zachary. Over the next few weeks, Ruby's farm began to take shape. The garden was fully planted, the seeds pushing up through the soil in neat rows. Mason brought her 2 milk cows and a dozen chickens on loan, he insisted when she protested the gift. "You can pay me back when they start producing." True to his word, Mason courted her properly. He took her on picnics by the stream, brought her books from his own library, and escorted her to Sunday services in town. The townspeople watched their developing relationship with interest, gossip giving way to acceptance as they saw Mason's obvious regard for Ruby. Even Frank Darnell kept his distance, though Ruby occasionally caught him watching her with calculating eyes when she visited town. Mason's protection made a difference, but Ruby never relaxed her vigilance. The rifle remained loaded and within reach, especially when she was alone at the cabin. On a warm evening in late June, Mason invited Ruby to dinner at his ranch. It was the first time she'd seen the Double Z, and she was impressed by the solid, 2-story house Mason had built. It was larger than her cabin, of course, but still modest by Eastern standards, practical and sturdy, like the man himself. "It's not fancy," Mason said as he showed her around, "but it's home." "It's wonderful," Ruby said sincerely, admiring the large stone fireplace and the comfortable furnishings. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on agriculture, animal husbandry, and classic literature. Dinner was served by Hank, the ranch cook, a feast of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from Ruby's garden. They ate at a large oak table in the dining room with linen napkins and Mason's best china. "This feels like a special occasion," Ruby observed as Mason poured wine into her glass. "It is." There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, anticipation, perhaps, or nervousness. "At least, I hope it will be." After dinner, they sat on the wide porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold. Mason seemed unusually quiet, his thoughts elsewhere. "Is everything all right?" Ruby asked finally. "You seem preoccupied." Mason turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Ruby, about the future, about us." A flutter of anticipation rose in Ruby's chest. "Oh. I told you once that independence doesn't have to mean being alone. I believe that more strongly now than ever." He took her hand. "These past weeks, watching you build your farm, seeing your determination and courage, it's only made me admire you more." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had this made in town. Mr. Franklin knows a silversmith who does fine work." Ruby's breath caught as Mason opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring with a small, perfect sapphire. "Ruby Ellison, I love you. Your strength, your spirit, your heart, everything about you. I want to spend my life with you, building something together that's greater than what either of us could create alone." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and hopeful. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Ruby's eyes. This was not what she had expected when she came to Wyoming, not what she had planned or sought. Yet here it was, a chance at a different kind of independence, one shared with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Mason, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he drew her into his arms and kissed her their first kiss, gentle at first, then deepening with all the emotion they'd held in check for weeks. When they finally drew apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you, Ruby, your land remains yours. We'll work both properties together, but I'll never ask you to give up what you've built." "I know," she touched his face. "That's part of why I love you." They were married 2 weeks later in Timber Creek's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, even Frank Darnell, though he stayed at the back and left before the celebration afterward. Ruby wore a new dress of ivory silk ordered specially from Cheyenne, and Mason looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new black suit. Mrs. Holloway wept openly during the ceremony. Charlie and the ranch hands cheered when Mason kissed his bride. And as they rode back to the Double Z Ranch in a wagon decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, Ruby realized that she had found something in Timber Creek that she'd never expected. Not just independence, but belonging. They decided to divide their time between Ruby's farm and Mason's ranch house, expanding the cabin over time to make it more comfortable. Mason kept his promise the farm remained Ruby's, and he consulted her on all decisions regarding both properties. Together, they weathered the harsh Wyoming winter, the threat of rustlers, and the constant challenges of frontier life. Ruby's garden flourished, providing vegetables for both households and enough to sell in town. The milk cows produced well, and the chicken flock expanded. Ruby even started a small orchard, planting apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come. By their first anniversary, Ruby was expecting their first child. As she and Mason sat on the porch of her cabin, their cabin now watching the sunset, she leaned against his shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day in town?" she asked. When everyone was laughing at the woman who came to Timber Creek alone, Mason smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Let them laugh, you're mine now." "I was so indignant," Ruby remembered. "I didn't belong to anyone, least of all some stranger in a dusty cow town. And now," she placed his hand on her growing belly where their child moved beneath his palm, "now I know you didn't mean possession, you meant protection, partnership. Family," Mason added softly. "Though I'll admit I wasn't thinking that far ahead at the time, I just knew I couldn't let them run you out of town before I had a chance to know you," Ruby laughed. "And now look at us. The Eastern spinster and the Wyoming rancher, building something neither of us could have built alone." Mason kissed her gently. "I'd say we've proved them all wrong." "We certainly have." As the last light faded from the sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear. Ruby thought of how far she'd come from that day she'd stepped off the stagecoach. She had found her independence, yes, but she'd found so much more as well: love, family, community. A true home. In the end, they had not only silenced the laughter of Timber Creek, they had transformed it into respect, admiration, and finally, acceptance. Ruby and Mason Zachary had built something remarkable together, a life that honored both their dreams and created new ones neither could have imagined alone. And it had all begun with a woman brave enough to come to town alone, and a cowboy who saw not her vulnerability, but her strength. 5 years later, Ruby stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Mason taught their son, James, to ride his first pony. Their daughter, Emma, just 3, clutched Ruby's skirt and watched with wide eyes as her brother bounced precariously in the small saddle. The farm had grown along with their family. The garden now covered a full acre, producing vegetables for their table and to sell in town. The orchard trees were beginning to bear fruit. A proper barn stood where once there had been only open meadow, housing the milk cows, chickens, and Mason's horses when he stayed at the farm. They still divided their time between the farm and the ranch, though they spent more time at the farm during the growing season and at the ranch during the harsh winter months. It was an arrangement that suited them both, honoring Ruby's independence while acknowledging their partnership. Timber Creek had grown as well. The railroad had finally come through, bringing new settlers and businesses. Ruby's vegetables and preserves were in high demand at the general store, and she had started teaching some of the town's children basic reading and arithmetic 3 afternoons a week. Frank Darnell had left town 2 years earlier, after a failed attempt to corner the local grain market left him deeply in debt. His saloon was now run by a jovial Irishman who kept a more respectable establishment. As Ruby watched her family, contentment filled her heart. This was what she had built with her own hands and determination: this home, this life, this legacy that would continue through her children. Mason looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that smile still made her heart skip a beat. He lifted their son from the pony and set him on his feet, then crossed to join Ruby on the porch. "He's a natural," Mason said, ruffling James's hair as the boy ran to join his sister. "Gets it from his mother," Ruby laughed. "I believe you're the one who grew up on horseback, not me." But you're the one who rode into Timber Creek alone and faced down an entire town without flinching. He slipped his arm around her waist. Our children have that courage in their blood. Ruby leaned into his embrace, watching as James showed Emma how to offer an apple to the patient pony. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd taken your offer to buy this land that first week? You never would have. Mason's certainty made her smile. That's what told me you were special, Ruby. You knew what you wanted and wouldn't settle for less. Even when what I wanted turned out to be different than I expected, especially then. He turned her to face him. We've built something good here, haven't we? Ruby looked around at the thriving farm, at their beautiful children, at the man who had become her partner in all things. Better than good, she said softly. We've built something perfect. As the Wyoming sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the land in gold and amber, Mason kissed his wife tenderly. Behind them, their children laughed as they fed the pony, their voices carrying across the land that would someday be theirs. And Ruby knew with absolute certainty that every mile of her journey, every hardship, every moment of doubt had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Not to independence alone, but to this richer, fuller life, one built on love, respect, and the courage to face whatever came next together. They had silenced the laughter of Timber Creek years ago. Now all that remained was the joy they had created for themselves, a joy that would echo through generations to come.